polymorphic love-hate relationship of this world with the polymath. What is a polymath? A polymath Greek, pi omicron lambda upsilon mu alpha theta, sigma, polymaths. Having learned much, Latin, homo universalis, universal human, is an individual whose knowledge spans a substantial number of subjects, known to draw on complex bodies of knowledge to solve specific problems. In Western Europe, the first work to use the term polymathy in its title De Polymathia Tractatio Integrio Paris de Studies Vetrum was published in 1603 by Johann von Wauern, a Hamburg philosopher. Von Wauern defined polymathy as knowledge of various matters, drawn from all kinds of studies, ranging freely through all the fields of the disciplines as far as the human mind with unwearied industry is able to pursue them. Von Wauern lists erudition, literature, philology, philomathy, and polyhistory as synonyms. Polymaths include the great scholars and thinkers of the Renaissance and Enlightenment, who excelled at several fields in science, technology, engineering, mathematics, and the arts. In the Italian Renaissance, the idea of the polymath was allegedly expressed by Leon Battista Alberti 1402–1472, a polymath himself, in the statement that a man can do all things if he will. Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz has often been seen as a polymath. Al Bruni was also a polymath. Leonardo da Vinci, Hildegard of Bingen, Rabindranath Tagore, Mikhail Lomonosov, Benjamin Franklin, Charles Sanders Peirce, and Thomas Jefferson are other well-known and celebrated polymaths, embodying a basic tenet of Renaissance humanism that humans are limitless in their capacity for development. The concept led to the notion that people should embrace all knowledge and develop their capacities as fully as possible. This is expressed in the term Renaissance man, often applied to the gifted people of that age who sought to develop their abilities in all areas of accomplishment: intellectual, artistic, social, technical, and spiritual. Peter Burke, Professor Emeritus of Cultural History and Fellow of Emmanuel College at Cambridge, discussed the theme of polymathy in some of his works. He has presented a comprehensive historical overview of the ascension and decline of the polymath as what he calls an intellectual species. He observes that in ancient and medieval times, scholars did not have to specialize. However, from the 17th century on, the rapid rise of new knowledge in the Western world, both from the systematic investigation of the natural world and from the flow of information coming from other parts of the world, was making it increasingly difficult for individual scholars to master as many disciplines as before. Thus, an intellectual retreat of the polymath species occurred from knowledge in every academic field to knowledge in several fields, and from making original contributions in many fields to a more passive consumption of what has been contributed by others. Given this change in the intellectual climate, it has since then been more common to find passive polymaths who consume knowledge in various domains but make their reputation in one single discipline, than proper polymaths who, through a feat of intellectual heroism, manage to make serious contributions to several disciplines. However, Burke warns that in the age of specialization, polymathic people are more necessary than ever, both for synthesis to paint the big picture and for analysis. He says, it takes a polymath to mind the gap and draw attention to the knowledges that may otherwise disappear into the spaces between disciplines, as they are currently defined and organized. Finally, he suggests that governments and universities should nurture a habitat in which this endangered species can survive, offering students and scholars the possibility of interdisciplinary work. In his 2018 book, The Polymath, British author Wakas Ahmet defines polymaths as those who have made significant contributions to at least 3 different fields. Rather than seeing polymaths as exceptionally gifted, he argues that every human being has the potential to become one, that people naturally have multiple interests and talents. He contrasts this polymathic nature against what he calls the cult of specialization. For example, education systems stifle this nature by forcing learners to specialize in narrow topics. The book argues that specialization encouraged by the production lines of the Industrial Revolution is counterproductive both to the individual and wider society. It suggests that the complex problems of the 21st century need the versatility, creativity, and broad perspectives characteristic of polymaths. For individuals, Ahmed says, specialization is dehumanizing and stifles their full range of expression, whereas polymathy is a powerful means to social and intellectual emancipation which enables a more fulfilling life. In terms of social progress, he argues that answers to specific problems often come from combining knowledge and skills from multiple areas, and that many important problems are multi-dimensional in nature and cannot be fully understood through one specialism. Rather than interpreting polymathy as a mix of occupations or of intellectual interests, Ahmed urges a breaking of the thinker-doer dichotomy and the art-science dichotomy. He argues that an orientation towards action and towards thinking support each other, and that human beings flourish by pursuing a diversity of experiences as well as a diversity of knowledge. He observes that successful people in many fields have cited hobbies and other peripheral activities as supplying skills or insights that help them succeed. Ahmed cites many historical claims for the advantages of polymathy. Some of these are about general intellectual abilities that polymaths apply across multiple domains. For example, Aristotle wrote that full understanding of a topic requires, in addition to subject knowledge, a general critical thinking ability that can assess how that knowledge was arrived at. Another advantage of a polymathic mindset is in the application of multiple approaches to understanding a single issue. Ahmed cites biologist E.O. Wilson's view that reality is approached not by a single academic discipline, but via a consilience between them. One argument for studying multiple approaches is that it leads to open-mindedness. Within any one perspective, a question may seem to have a straightforward, settled answer. Someone aware of different, contrasting answers will be more open-minded and aware of the limitations of their own knowledge. The importance of recognizing these limitations is a theme that Ahmed finds in many thinkers, including Confucius, Ali ibn Ablib, and Nicholas of Cusa. He calls it the essential mark of the polymath. A further argument for multiple approaches is that a polymath does not see diverse approaches as diverse because they see connections or other people see differences. For example, Da Vinci advanced multiple fields by applying mathematical principles to each. Bureaucratic systems have a particular disdain for polymaths due to the nature their hyper-specialization machine-like cultures. They tend to see polymathic people as dangerously nonconformist, and thus see their lack of organizational, siloed, narrow-band homogeneity as a threat to the status quo. Hence, as this mindset permeates society, elevates the conformist and tends towards isolating, alienating, and mitigating the polymathic. Such a society does not comprehend that the existence of their societies and the benefits enjoyed by those therein are in fact in many cases due to the contributions of the very polymaths they then come to see as with disdain, distrust, and even hatred. This pattern through history has been an indicator of a society or nation-state in decline. This is so because those societies shut out and even seek to remove from their societies the polymaths when they need them most, to turn their ailing conditions round. In some cases, these entropic societies sequester and siphon off their ideas, work and lives to the ruling elites and their interest in order to profit upon them, while refusing to actually allow them the freedom to be the change agents polymaths tend towards being. The result is a society that accepts the counterfeits of polymaths. There are those who are in reality further corrupting the very societies the polymaths are equipped to actually turn around. Thus the counterfeits see the polymaths as a threat to their positions, wealth, power, influence, and control, even as they are dependent upon them as a kind of human sacrificial food source. This is how many organizations and governments function in their late-stage entropy. Thus they actually further their own degradation and self-destruction in doing so. It is best stated that what occurs is that people and nations alike turn their blessings into curses. Many polymaths throughout the centuries have been the very transformative thinkers and leaders who have changed history. Many of the kings, prophets, inventors, and intellectuals to have had the greatest impacts on the world were in fact polymathic. The birth of America in particular was due to many of its founders being polymathic-minded. The history of America itself has been driven by such individuals who often in great times of crisis appear on the scene and rise to positions which have rescued the nation from great perils. Many also gifted the nation with great innovations and understanding at just the right time to make America both prosperous, strong, and more morally and ethically grounded in truth. Sadly, in our times, America has become prey to the very distrust of polymaths that have led to the dissolution, desolation, and destruction which have characterized the fall of many civilizations, nations, and empires throughout history. Here again we are the patterns in history converging with our own times with great consequence. The requiem of civilization is found in its hatred towards the spiritual, intellectual, creative, and polymathic people it has steadily turned against in its debauched reveries which degenerate the societies where and even as it leads them towards their destruction in the darkness of their hearts and minds. Mind first narrowed by fear and confusion, then darkened by pride and insanity. I have for my entire life watched this occur and been subject to its projected self-immolation of the polymath. It has been for me as one sojourning through the depths of the underworld seeking to find a way to the sunlit surface, yet to my amazement only to find that the sunlight is that which is from within did so illuminate the darkness which seeks to first ensnare and then enslave those caught in its unseen machinations in itself. For in hit one lifetime I have experienced many lifetimes, and in but one single moment found this place to be accurately called the Valley of the Shadow of Death. It is the underworld externalized and projected by force upon all flesh, even as it is but a counterfeit, a shadow of the real world, lit by the eternal light and warmth of God Almighty. Now allow me to share a bit more about how I have come to view things as I now do. When I was a child, I was enthralled with visions of the future. I devoured anything I could my hands on that painted a picture of what the future could be like. One of the biggest influences on me was that of visiting Disney World. Every trip to Florida sparked my creativity and helped to fuel dreams of my own on what life in the future could be. Reading encyclopedias from age 3 onward, my curious mind always gravitated towards learning about anything that piqued my interests. And many interests I did have. I still do. Before and after our family visits to Disney, I would study as much as I could about the trip, including the states, cities, and town along the route from the Midwest to Florida. It was a natural thing for me to indulge my curiosity through those encyclopedias. I daily digested information as diverse as the physical sciences to history and design. Very early I had begun to develop deep wells of knowledge across many different areas of knowledge. So much so that school was neither challenging nor inspiring to me because it never connected the dots between subject matter. For example, if in a social studies class I would ask questions about nations and peoples that appeared to be seemingly divergent from the rigid lesson plans, there was this fire in me to learn and discuss and apply what I was learning about in creative ways. This was not how our education system was constructed. I quickly found out. Many a teacher labeled me a troublemaker, not working up to potential, no focusing on the study material, and even was branded a troublemaker. I hated school not because I hated learning, but rather because it was like sucking air through a straw to me due to the rigidity and disconnectedness of the various subjects. The dots were not being connected, and my fire for seeing how those dots did connect along with my curiosity and creativity was nearly always seen as a problem to be mitigated or fixed rather than explored and understood. Thankfully, away from school, I kept my actual passion for learning, creating, exploring, and connecting the dots intact and alive, albeit damaged and perplexed due to the rather myopic nature of most kids and adults whom I encountered in and out of school settings. Admittedly, I was not a typical kid, nor was my playtime. I often retreated alone to my parents' basement, where I would create total immersion playtime experiences by designing and building entire miniature cities and civilizations with which I would game out various real and imagined scenarios ranging from annual county fairs to natural calamities. I would game out responses and ways to make these worlds more resilient and livable. I would also game out more darker visions of the past, present, and future, such as wars and natural disasters, Little Green Army Men, and the journey back to the future. So how did a little kid start down that path? Looking back, it is clear to see how what I was seeing, hearing, and experiencing in my daily life was naturally flowing into my thirst for knowledge, love of learning, and a deep desire to understand. There is no doubt these things were informed by the reality of a strange, complex, and often painfully dark world I was trying desperately to make sense of. Though my parents tried to shield me from the darker realities of the world at large, my earliest memories are not of a bright and cheery, hopeful world. In fact, my first memory around age 3 was that of the Vietnam War. It was 1972, and America was bugging out of the Southeastern Asian conflict. The memory I retain was that of seeing a nightly news broadcast with Walter Cronkite detailing the pullout of American troops amidst ongoing fighting. Even now I can see the olive-green uniforms of the soldiers and equipment and hear the whirling rotors of choppers in my mind as I write this. My 3-year-old mind was perplexed. I simply could understand why people were killing one another. Somehow I knew that was what they were doing, yet it was still a rather abstract concept to a young boy. I asked my parents why people were doing that, hurting one another, killing one another. My father sat at me on his knee after turning off the TV, probably trying to shield me from the visuals of such horrors, and then proceeded to explain what I had seen and why it was happening. That was my first experience with the concept of war, though my father did his best to explain it, and quite well he did. The concept didn't make sense to me. It began my search to understand why it existed and the world was the way it must be. It also fueled my desire to think about what the future might be like in both good and bad terms. That was the moment I started diving into everything I could to learn about this alien world and its bifurcated reality. Nothing new under the sun. When I was a child, I always wondered why people would say there is nothing new under the sun. Then, as an adult, I learned that the reason for this was the fact that every generation collectively fails to learn the lessons from the past, thinking themselves immune from the past simply because they thought themselves so much more evolved and advanced than all the previous ones in history. They did this because they based their perspective upon the misleading outward appearances of technological advances, while ignoring the need for and the source of wisdom and understanding gained only from a proper spiritual and intellectual foundation, worldview, humility, and a desire to learn from the mistakes and triumphs of past generations. Worldview and human history are vital foundation stones for building one's life upon. This is not entirely each generation's fault. After all, it is the parents' responsibility and the broader society's aggregated effects upon them which should first have facilitated laying that foundation, then edifying and encouraging its continuance through example-driven reinforcement. However, once past the childhood years and entering into the late teens and young adulthood phases of life, each individual in that generation faces a choice to grow up into an adult or become retrograde and settle at some lesser version of adulthood. That is a fox growth based only upon the shallows of externality and the shadows of hollow temporality, detached from emotional, intellectual, and spiritual growth and maturity. The middle path leads to authentic growth with depth, and the separate opposing polarities offer but mirages. Let's look at how your system and unprincipled people undermine things and deceive you into believing their lies and machinations. The bridge that united and divided a city. Another way of putting it is this way. There was once a small city in the heartland of a large country. The city was equally built on both sides of a large river which ran through the middle of the country. Now this country had been forced to fight a terrible war against a very crafty enemy in a foreign land. A group of engineers had been enlisted to help build all manner of roads, bridges, schools, hospitals, and the like in the places where they had to wage this war. Every time they built one, the enemy forces would come in and destroy it. This became costly and time-consuming, not to mention unsafe, for the rest of the army, who was counting on these construction projects to win over the local population to their side, hoping to help them build a better society. Now, as the costs mounted up, this little group of engineers used each opportunity to rebuild, to innovate and create new means and methods to build things better, faster, and cheaper with less materials. As the war continued, they became very good at this new way of building. Eventually the war ended, and they came back home to that little town in the heartland and decided that they would start a business together, taking what they had learned to bid on the first bridge to be built to cross the river and connect both sides of the city, making it easier for citizens to work together and grow it. They designed a beautiful bridge, one that the city officials thought for sure they could never pay for due to its unique design. However, the little group of engineers revealed to them that in fact it would actually cost less than the annual operating funds necessary for the single ferry service which shuttled people to and fro from one side of the city to the other. Amazed at this prospect, they quickly brought the matter to the citizens, who enthusiastically embraced the plan, leading to the bid being accepted and the construction of the bridge starting. Now one might be wondering why it had taken so long to build a bridge in the first place. Well, previous to this little group of engineers forming their company and submitting a plan to the city, not one other bridge-building company in the nation had bothered, even considered this small city worthy of their time to even approach the community to build a bridge. This was so because these big companies built very costly bridges with expensive maintenance plans, which only wealthier and larger cities could afford to pay for. So when this little upstart bridge company broke ground on a new bridge in the small city, it got the attention of the big boys who wanted to see what fools would even attempt to do such a thing with so little experience and financial resources. They were stunned to find out that this little group of engineers had created a way to build bridges at a low cost that were far superior to those they built. They also were shocked to see that not only were these bridges cheaper, but they were also stronger, had lower maintenance, and would be safely usable decades longer than anything they themselves built. The heads of these big companies met together secretly and found that they all had a big problem. They had a competitor which not only had a better way of doing things, but one which could undercut their large profit margins, potentially putting them out of business. Now note that it never crossed their minds to do anything innovative, to change how they had always done them, and although they did briefly consider trying to buy out or steal the means and methods this little company had developed, they kept finding disagreement. After discussing the options, they realized none of them trusted one another and were concerned one of them would somehow offer more money to buy the little company out and then had the advantage over the rest of them. Now they all agree that if they convince a third party to steal the intellectual property of the little company, they could share it and all increase their profit margins while keeping the cost per project at the same level it was already at. This, they agreed, was a much more favorable thing to do. However, if they stole the intellectual property of the little upstart, there was a high likelihood that the public might figure out that they stole or copied the way these guys built bridges, yet ripped the taxpayer off, possibly causing all of their business to go to the little company they feared to begin with. That is when one of the big company heads devised a very devious plan. He proposed this: if they could be patient for a few years, they could put the pressure on their suppliers to supply the little company inferior or even sabotaged materials and bridge components, which were to be used in key structural areas of the bridge. In doing this, they could ensure that in a matter of a very short few years, all of those bridges would start having serious safety and maintenance issues, which would put the little company and their new bridge design and build process into a very bad predicament. The kind of predicament they could then use against them even more by creating false evidence, making it appear the little company had been cutting costs by knowingly using inferior materials and components. The false evidence would be given to their suppliers along with larger sums of cash to seal the deal with the suppliers, who would make money on every step while sealing the fate of the little upstart bridge company. When it was bankrupt, the big boys would all buy up equal stakes in the company, gaining the intellectual property and gaining all of the bridge contracts the little company had acquired before their demise. Then the big boys would offer to fix the very bridges they sabotaged at what would appear to be a discounted price, making them look like public servants stepping in together for the public good when actually they were plundering the taxpayers even more. It was a stunningly easy yet terribly wicked plan. So much so all the big companies agreed to the Faustian bargain offered, and the great deception was put into motion. Not once did any of these corporate heads consider the possibility of the harm that could happen to the public using those bridges. A new bridge was designed and built 50 years ago using the best technology, methods, and materials available at the time. It was a wonderfully constructed bridge which performed flawlessly for decades with not even a hint of problems. However, over the course of years and hundreds of thousands of safe crossing by vehicles of all kinds, those who built it failed to see that microscopic fracturing was occurring in key points in the bridge's superstructure. Over time, these began to spider web throughout that key section of the bridge. When the first maintenance crews began to see the fractures visually, they began to keep records of it and tell the engineers that they were seeing the beginning of what could be a problem. The engineers, having built the bridge, knew what tolerances it was built to withstand and how long it could remain in use before costly repairs would make it necessary to do something. These engineers evaluated the data from the crews and told them there was nothing to be concerned about. The bridge was at least 25 years away from it having any problems, which might cause potential safety to those traversing it. The next day, the 500,000th first car ever to the bridge began to cross it. By any measure, it was an insignificant event by a vehicle that was by far smaller than most which used the bridge daily for decades. The little car filled with a young family with 3 preschool-aged kids and a toddler reached the middle of the bridge when suddenly the middle truss shattered, collapsing the entire center section of the bridge, tossing that little car with a young family into the swirling waters of the river 150 feet below. All die. The bridge had failed. An avoidable tragedy had occurred, all because of a misreading of the crew data, which was biased by those charged with having built and maintaining that bridge. And why was this? They failed to even consider that their calculations and predictions on the effective life of that bridge might have some flaws which they had not counted on, or that some other unforeseen thing might have affected the structural integrity of their work. After all, they have been so successful at bridge building. They had a perfect safety record with hundreds of bridges they designed and built. What they did not account for was that a supplier who had not won the bid for the construction job had paid off the people who delivered that pre-built section to exchange it for one of inferior materials. That bridge had been sabotaged years previous to the day the tragedy occurred. That singular event set in motion a series of costly consequences, whereas every single bridge those engineers had ever built came into heavy scrutiny. Meanwhile, a mysterious leaker had been providing false evidence of wrongdoing by the bridge company to the press and authorities, compounding the nightmare. The public was outraged and fearful of using nearly all bridges regardless of who built them, and the bridge company found itself in a flood of lawsuits and bad press, which eventually forced it into bankruptcy. So what happened? Well, the company and those engineers had been set up, and when they made a single mistake in looking at their data on the bridge which collapsed, the stage had long been set to use it against them and destroy their reputations, success in business. And what of the other bridges they had built? Well, after a costly and lengthy assessment of the safety of the other bridges built by that company, state and federal authorities found 75% were unsafe, and every single bridge they had built has varying degrees of corrosion and failing structural components. It would seem that from the very beginning of the once successful company's first bid, their competitors had conspired to not just lock them out of future markets and opportunities, but to destroy the little company who had become successful due to the innovations it had created to make bridge building safer and more cost-effective. The competitors saw this as a threat to their control of other markets, all of which they had conspired to artificially inflate the building and maintenance costs, ensuring their dominance in bridge building. Now, of course, having been in the industry far longer, and the new upstart little bridge company, these competitors knew all of the suppliers who produced the components and supplied the building materials to the industry. Having seen the writing on the wall, they used their economic weight to force short-term complicity to collude in the great deception. Now consider the times we're in and how this parable I just told you represents what has been going on behind the veil of government, business, and a multitude of other areas of society. The inherent evil of this is made possible because most people never look beyond the external appearances of things, making themselves vulnerable to deception. Polymaths and self-taught colonists, most without anything approaching what we would call credentials or experience, built America and conceived its form of government. Managers and others who then took over, fearing the kind of people who built the very thing that gave them the opportunity to screw it up. How ironic, isn't it? Nothing new under the sun, or a blood-red moon on election day. Are you a nation of mediocrity or meritocracy? One of the biggest problems in our present times is the elevation of mediocre over the meritocratic. It is also finding and engaging competent and talented people in an entropic and often mitigating environment of mediocrity as a virtue follies. The pathways to and from talent for organizational acquisition needs to be found in a novel and deeper level of analysis, better processes and procedures and requirements. 1. Lowest common denominator testing, evaluation, and analysis yet is not user-friendly for the lowest common denominator. WXUX user experience design for intra-government and intergovernmental platforms and systems are needed. 2. The system is designed for mediocrity and lowest common denominator thinking nor for identifying, interacting with, and enabling the gifted and most capable. This is the result of either or thinking and not both and necessity. 3. Generalists and polymathic thinkers are pushed aside and mitigated. This is due to myopic metrics affecting the identification and testing and placement of such individuals. 4. Meritocratic incentivizing of needed talent is more than just employment. It is also organizational culture and enablement of talent to contribute their talents, skills, abilities, ideas, and creativity to their organizations. Using these metrics alone, college degrees, certifications, job histories, income levels, personality tests, siloed expertise do not accurately measure capabilities, latent talent, knowledge base, applied knowledge abilities, nor the willingness to contribute and be a success. Personality types alone do not accurately access this either. Most of these metrics were designed by and for linear, rules-based conformity individuals who project and then impose their own myopathies upon the implemented requirements, processes, and procedures and expectations for employment and new opportunities. These all are subject to entropic effects over time in both quality of leadership, personnel, and organizational effectiveness. This is the nature of bureaucracy and bureaucratic thinking. Thus they suffer more and more from insufficient critical thinking skills, effective problem-solving, and innovative creative thinking needed to breathe life into the organization to keep it relevant, profitable beyond short-term next quarter thinking, and adaptive in the marketplace. Hence, amplified entropic effects accelerate. This is a societal, cultural, economic, corporate, and educational bureaucratic rigid mindset as well as a process, procedure, systems architecture, and requirements problem. It also reveals a misappropriation, misapplication, and misuse of systems of knowledge and processes oozed out of their intended context, causing further entropy, rigidity, ineffectiveness, and confusion. People are not machines. Machines are machines. Machines should adapt to people, not the other way around. Technology should serve human beings, not force human beings to serve machines. Likewise for organizations and how they function. How ironic it is. So many demand, many of us condescend to jump through the very hoops and wander around the very labyrinth of the very system, which is destroying itself by forcing people to do so. Yet these blind and asleep people cannot see this nor understand why many of us refuse to join them in a Titanic of their own making. For this they see us as a threat to their own self-destruction, calling us the unreasonable and illogical ones. It is akin to the shadow saying to that which cast the shadow on the ground that it needs the shadow, when in fact the opposite of true. The shadow would not exist without the light and physical object which cast it to the ground in the first place. There it will remain. We shall not join it nor condescend to its demands, but we will expose it and crush it. Only a fool would agree to board the titanic bureaucratic ship of state and commerce that is already sinking, believing the waves of its own making. Yet that is precisely what you systems and this nation has attempted to force so many of us into. Likewise, because many of us are not greedy, mammon-worshipping spiritual and ideological prostitutes, what made you think we were simply here to be fuel for yours? Is it theft to take back that which taken wrongly from many of us to begin with? Should the unprincipled people among you who obtained their great wealth through questionable means be allowed to not only revel in their own gains, but also to plunder out of those whom they built their fortunes upon? Should the thief be angered by those whom they plundered to begin with, when they began taking back that which was stolen from them by such criminals? Tell me, if your nation is functioning so well, why is it that it is incapable of solving any of your problems? Are we to believe that the very ones who created the problems and have done so for decades are the very ones who are going to rescue the nation from the very conditions they caused, when all they do reveals the opposite of their words? The fool and autocrat are like that of the bureaucracy and the machines of cannibal capitalism and unrestrained, unaccountable corporatocracy. They are the architects of their own demise. To join such fools in the Titanic of their own making is not only foolish, but it is as utterly absurd as it is self-destructive. When a person, organization, or nation elevates mental illness and moral depravity to the heights of the land, it is sure that the land has fallen from the heights of its glories into darkness of its delusional self-immolations. Thus is the Tao of the fool and the corrupted having jettisoned truth for the counterfeits of it. Well, we don't call them delusional without reason. They are proving it before your very eyes. A narrow mind reveals a darkened heart leading one down the broad path to destruction. A closed mind reveals one who is enslaved to pride, fear, and confusion. As for people, so too for the nation and nations. There comes a time in the existence of every nation-state when the lesser of the two or more evils simply does not suffice to extract the civilization from its downward spiral. You have arrived at that point. You will remain in it until you let it go. Why you don't have or cannot find your polymaths is you fear and hate them in America, but you cannot survive without them. As your nation rots like corpse in the nowadays, and this should plainly obvious even to the most narrow and dull-minded among you. That is why I tell you that you are your own worst enemies. You are destroying yourself as a nation by myriad of self-inflicted wounds. It is not those of us who will conform to your system. Your system will be transformed by us. That is, if it survives its present state of desolation, degradation, stupefaction, rigor mortis, like bureaucratistan and delusional idiocy. The present predicament this nation is in exposes the folly of its pride, ignorance, and selfishness born of individual and organizational insecurity and mediocrity. It will fall if you remain on this trajectory. That generally occurs when your leadership across the seven spheres lacks vision, wisdom, truth, and intellect sufficient enough to stem the coming calamities manufactured by the absence of them. Such a nation having done that perilous path is one best characterized by being overcome by its darkness and destroyed by its avarice and hubris. That is a late-stage empire or nation-state. The same holds true for the institutions and organizations within them. Americans fear polymathic thinkers. I know I have lived in that reality my entire life. I still deal with it now. It is an endemic problem in both the public and private sectors. It shakes the sensitivities and rigid thinking of people, organizations, and institutions who have built their bureaucracies upon rigid specialization, siloed thinking, nearly tyrannical forced conformity, and broad-based insecurity and incompetence. How every America was not always that way. It was built by polymathic self-taught thinkers. It is those polymathic thinkers that have rescued this nation from its entropy and movement towards the entropy of mediocrity born of rigidity and fear many times. You are in that time again. Yet the nation is more hostile to polymaths, so much so they see us as a threat to be mitigated and eradicated, instead of a blessing and loyal citizens and problem solvers. You have isolated them, plundered them, treated them as enemies, feared and sought to break them. This too I can attest to. In fact, your system has barred most of us from participating in this society in a myriad of ways. It has even branded many of us as dangerous. To do such a thing is patently delusional thinking. It is self-destructive to the nation, while having an absolutely degenerative impact on the society and all the 7 spheres thereof. Such foolishness reveals much as to why the nation has atrophied at the pace it has. It is a sign of a falling nation, not one which can avoid it. So here we are. And here is a quantum reality check on the notions of what you think you may live in. When I speak of the metasphere, this is one way I often explain it. You can only use temporal means to measure temporal things. All of it points to a much larger reality beyond the finite confines of the temporal reality you can measure and observe. You can observe some things that infer the existence of something that is beyond temporal means of measurement by how it exerts an influence on things you can measure, such as what you call dark energy and dark matter. However, what is not measurable beyond the temporal 3D plus time and space is the wall between the finite and the infinite. The finite points to the existence of the infinite in that its dimensional construct is one which allows you to see the effects of the unobservable in that which is observable in the temporal. Beyond that, it is the meta-dimensional reality which the observable finite construct does exist. Your POV is in the temporal. Your observations or lack thereof doesn't negate the possibility or inherent probability of the metasphere. In fact, all your research does in fact point to it regardless of your denial of it or not. Does a child pick up a single grain of sand and believe that in doing so he has picked up the entire sandy shoreline? No, yet the blueprints of the entire sandy shoreline is seen the single grain of sand. The child can understand this, yet the so-called greatest among you cannot. Do you think because you can measure what is temporal that you are omniscient on matter which are outside of your point of view in the temporal? Many of you do think so. That is not actual science. That is faith. Faith in your own observations and assumptions about the reality in which you have your being. Yet many mock those who speak of the spiritual realm, eternity, and matters of faith as though they are somehow more evolved and advanced. That is pride. It may very well have blinded you to the actual reality you are existing in both the temporal and that which is beyond the observable, though ever present in superposition with you. You fear what you cannot control from your elaborate systems, explained from your subjective point of view and knowledge base. You fear because you actually fear that it might threaten to expose your insufficiencies, insecurities, hidden agendas, illusion of power, reputation, and most importantly, your pride. Fear and confusion will never lead you out of it, only into more of it. The more you have of it, the more vulnerable and fragile you become to actual threats that will bring actually fears of real things made possible by your thinking, decision-making, and actions. So you mitigate, you cajole, slander, accuse, plunder, threaten, attempt to silence, discredit, strip of influence or resources. You devour, deny, and attack. You destroy and even kill all to protect and serve your pride, even when it works against your own best interests. You do so because you hate the light, love the notoriety you have obtained by being a false light, and love your darkness, never seeing that nothing is actually hidden in the actual light, including your pride. Thusly, the light outside you locks you into the darkness inside of you because you deny and refuse it, preferring your inner darkness born of your own pride. This is why you fall. This is why you create the very conditions for your own destruction. Broad is that highway, and it is always rush hour on it. Tick-tock. As it is for people, so too it is for nations. You can pretend all is okay. You can deny the predicament and wish it away, telling yourself that all will simply fix itself, that many among us have utterly wrecked, wasted, and plundered, but it will not suffice. If only it was that simple now. After years of the American manufacturing and now service-based jobs were shipped overseas, cannibal capitalism has destroyed the good-paying jobs where tens of millions of citizens. The government sanctioning of technology transfers to a pagan autocratic Chinese regime has ceded its technological edge in all industries, and in defense-related industries in particular, creating a foe that not only exceeds our financial and economic means, but also our personnel capabilities. All this for short-term gain. Never has one singular generation in America had so much and been so foolish with it as to cede it to their enemies for even more short-term selfish gain. The same generation has preceded over the faster moral and ethical decline in a nation-state in human history, transforming America in a drug-addicted, prostituted, rotting shell of its former, even then imperfect condition. As a nation, we are acting like demons, or claiming moral superiority in our depletion, desolation, and degeneration. The nation is rotting like a corpse in the noonday sun, and injustice is the norm, even as its catastrophic idiocy grows exponentially. Across every metric, the trend lines are downward at near 90-degree angles. This has only enriched the 1% and the 10%. Meanwhile, the devouring of America by Big Pharma and illicit drugs adds to the woes by murdering its own citizens for the profit of business and self-enrichment. I have no more defenses I can form to protect this nation from the accusations leveled against it, and could write damn near into eternity on all the layers of rot I see ongoing here. Let me tell you a story again I have offered to you before. The law of diminishing returns and the law of averages, an American parable. There once was a nation called the Republic of Bulgaria. It got its name from the fact that it had been built upon the concept of the bell curve. The system, which developed as a result of the Industrial Revolution, with its specialization of labor, also had a definitive impact on all the 7 spheres of social influence and human development. The resulting impacts led to the still valued siloed hyper-specialization and segmentation of the knowledge base, favored by corporations, military organizations, governmental bureaucracies, and in its extreme form rigidly controlled autocratic regimes, though intended for allowing for greater ease in management of complex organizations due to very real consistency and efficiency. Such means and methods also created a societal mindset based more on engineering and machines than that of living, dynamic, adaptive ecosystems. The resulting effects on educational systems was to create a teach to an over-reliance on standardization of means and methods applied to students with little regard for uniqueness of individual human beings. Now standardized human homogenization was good for the engineered mechanical industrial economy and the modern corporation-based society, but was not good for human beings themselves due to how it marginalized those whom did not fit the homogeneity of the majority averages of the bell curve programming. Those who fell below or above the majority curve were marginalized. When the digital disruption came to test the machine-manufactured industrial world, the needed polymathic non-siloed thinkers, the mavericks, needed to navigate it had been pushed out of the positions needed to help the organizations and institutions of the 7 spheres of influence adapt proactively to the great changes. This led to a predicament in which the once finely tuned machines of social class, commerce, and of government suddenly faced systemic entropic effects causing decreasing effectiveness and efficiencies while increasing rigidity and bureaucratic entrenchment, being that the machines had served humanity perfectly well. So thought the ruling managerial class and the engineering technocrats, the averages. A cloud of perplexity, and then a tidal wave of anger and bitterness swept through them and was pointed wrongly at the neo-polymathic generation who had been forced into the disruption much earlier to survive on the fringes due to having been marginalized out of the homogenized societal norms of the corporatocracy by the averages. As the averages realized that their great machine was not working as the original engineers had fashioned it to work, they began to look for a reason, any reason other than their own incompetence, that something had gone wrong in the machine. It could never have been their complacency and mismanagement due to their dulled, one might even say program, lack of vision. After all, the machine had constantly reinforced that the averages were anything but average, because they did what all successful normal people conformed to, what the machine's clearly defined rules, regulations, and expectations had demanded of them. So like the brother of the prodigal son, who shunned his returning brother and turned on his father, they became bitter as the maverick polymaths started to offer much-needed answers and solutions to solve the woes of the corroding machine. This threatened the comfort, power, and positions of the averages to such a degree that they began to see them as the problem itself, not a possible ally in solving the problems. Thusly they set out to bar any influence the mavericks might have on the general average controlled population, opting their means and methods to steal their ideas through use of the harvesting machines of commerce and state, once used only in wars and pre-wars against hostile nations and peoples. What the averages fail to mathematically compute was their own need for the ones they were setting out to wage a covert war against and devour. Being average yet thinking they were anything, but they also failed to comprehend that the mavericks were quite aware of what the averages might do, having been marginalized and mitigated by them throughout their own lives from birth. You see, the mavericks had already prepared for this and readied a plan of action that would allow the averages to think their covert war against them was successful, while allowing them to harvest from them information which had been bugged with problems when implemented by anyone other than themselves. The mavericks also had a better working knowledge of the machine and its strengths and weaknesses than did the averages, due to one simple fact of history which had not been accounted for. The originators of the ideas and the builders of the original machines had been mavericks themselves, who knew that over time the law of the averages always creates a greater law of diminishing returns, which cause any and all machines to break down and have to be replaced with something better when the timing and the next generation of mavericks would be born to implement it. Thusly the averages has in fact in their pride, jealousy, and hatred started the unfortunate series of events which brought into play that greater law of diminishing returns, which would create the very conditions for their capture and defeat once and for all by the last mavericks generation. Why do you suppose this happened? These fools did so after a prolonged dumbing down of the populace had long since occurred. This occurred as per the mathematically precise societal template having been implemented by the machine-engineered, homogenized, managed citizen model, which allowed the narrow-minded managerial and hyper-siloed engineering-minded technocratic ruling caste to manage an efficient, clearly defined, streamlined, and simplified social strata. They did this to maintain, in their narrow-band thinking, structural integrity and cultural consistency. However, it had the opposite effect, amplifying the entropic impacts within the entire society. Thus they sought to devour and mitigate the ones they needed the most, though they could not see it yet. So this is what happened and why. When all seemed to be going even better than planned by the averages, in that they were harvesting in such great quantities and growing richer and seemingly more powerful by the day. The machine even appeared to be self-correcting itself as they implemented the harvest from the now seemingly subdued and complicit mavericks, so much so the averages assume they had won the war over them, allowing complacency to crowd out their siloed reasoning, yet fueling even more disdain to the mavericks, whose ideas and solutions were in fact working. The averages, however, could not be content with this, so they purposed to destroy the mavericks and eliminate them as a possible future threat forever. So they drained them, worked some to near death, others they poisoned, still many more they drove mad. And when it looked as though the averages would have completely wiped out the mavericks, the machine suddenly started moving so fast that the various components began to shear off and break other parts of the machine. The condition worsened so quickly and with such tumult that the entire society began to come apart like the machine of machines was doing to itself. As the catastrophe worsened, the people of the bell curve and those below it began to turn on one another, and those averages were their managers over them, causing the entire machine to blow apart and stop. As the dust settled and the smoke began to clear, the averages that had survived the falling silence of the machine saw the mavericks standing together, all looking quite untouched by it, all looking at them. Many of those standing with them had been thought to be averages or lower than the averages. Yet there they were standing there, anything but average. Terror gripped the captured averages as they suddenly realized that they who had set the mavericks up had in fact been the ones set up by the mavericks, and that mavericks had been among their ranks all along and had been allowing it to appear they were average in order to once and for all put an end to average thinking and replace what had become a now less than average machine with something so extraordinary that no words could describe its true greatness. For it was not a machine, but rather a truly living new world, far beyond anything an average or even a maverick thinker could have envisioned. After seeing this, the remaining averages were banished to a recreation of the breaking machine they had in fact worshipped as an iron god. It now stood as a terrible monstrosity, with a great opening resembling a prison gate open in the middle, revealing something like a giant furnace, like it had been fashioned sideways like a mechanical, as a lake of fire such as one might see in a steel mill in the Middle Industrial Age. What does this look like today in your world? I think you know. So here is what to come and already is here. You will see large upticks in abhorrent behaviors and extreme violence prior to and during large natural phenomenal events. The current uptick in statistical anomalous violence occurring presently around the country and the world have a definitive relationship to increased cosmic ray levels, erratic movements in the magnetic poles, slight amplitude changes in the Earth's wobble, gravitational effects, the thinning of the magnetosphere and the resulting cascades effects on and in the energy spectrum, likewise a resulting corresponding aggregated effects on and in terra firma also mix with the former things to create increased conditions for psychophysiological induced episodic triggering. Cognitive predispositions to such influences make what seems like random and or sudden abhorrent micro-scaled human-centric events more likely. In a similar manner, and for the same reasons, outlier black swan events of a natural and obscure human-triggered origin have a higher potential for outbreaks during this convergence window. The pressure differentials in the natural order and in human-created systems cross one another's thresholds, causing maintaining restraint on the amplifying energetic systems leading to release. Thus, as for people, so too for the nation and nations, is this self-destructive circus of debauchery and desolation what you wish to be your final chapter written in the book of history. In conclusion, I delivered this message to my fellow Americans and those who lead this nation from my heart and mind, addressing the heart of the problems which afflict it. You must know that the counterfeits of the real will not suffice to change your predicament. There is a way out of it. That way requires personal responsibility, humility, honesty, and a willingness to have eyes to see it and ears to heart it. Many of us are no longer willing to accept counterfeits of the real in positions of leadership and power. We are willing to serve the highest good of this nation and the rest of the world to solve its actual problems. But you are going to have to do it on our terms now, because yours brought us to this point in our nation's history. Come to your senses and let us fix this country. If you will not allow that, then you bear the responsibility for refusing to by your own thinking, decision-making, and actions. It is time to change the trajectory of this nation for the good of all Americans in all truth, love, justice, and mercy. That requires humility. When humility is not present, humiliation is sure to follow at great consequence and terrible costs. We are capable of so much more than what have become as a nation. Permit me to offer you a more positive and hopeful perspective. There are a myriad of challenges we face as a nation. For us to overcome them, it will require cogent thinking, humility, and courage. All of those are a necessity, not an option. We must think beyond the bureaucratic rigidity and force adaptive and resilient thinking and doing. I know that is difficult in such times and of the current environment in both the public and private sectors. No one said this would be easy. Every generation has to rise to the challenge despite the obstacles and costs. If we are unwilling to do so, then we are also unwilling to have this republic. For to keep it, we must be the kinds of people and organizations which facilitate the proper thinking, character, due diligence, and fearless dedication to duty required for us to rise together. One of the great missing pieces of our present time is a national vision which helps inspire, enable, empower, equip, and encourage those who want to make a difference in their nation. This is something we must change. Everyone in this nation has something to contribute to the totality of the whole. I would like each of you to consider what that might look like in each of your respective areas of responsibility as well as in your own lives and communities. I ask this because the time is coming, and indeed is already at the door, when we must bring those ideas, concepts, and pieces together into that vision and plan for the nation. I humbly ask you to do so. I also wish to encourage you and hopefully inspire you in the near future to some of what can be if we are willing to rise to the challenge and come together to make it into a reality for all Mercians. May it be we write a better book of books together than the one we are individually and collectively writing in our divisions, pride, fears, and confusion. Crisis can destroy or build up. In the good times, people never see the vulnerabilities others may attempt to put a light upon. However, when a bad time comes, the vulnerabilities emerge in such a way that they cannot be ignored nor denied easily. This is when those who ignored the warnings during the good times are faced with a paradoxical juxtaposition which tests them to see if they are bound to their pride more than what letting go of it will yield in solving the problems their denial created in the first place. This is how truth and justice is always at work within the natural and man-made order. It was the basis for checks and balances which were built into our system before it got co-opted, distorted, taken for granted, and broken. This provides a ready-made environment that turned the negatives of weaknesses and brokenness into a positive strength and inspiration for building a brighter future for all. In short, we have a rare opportunity to make a positive impact in negative times. Importance of focusing public on a brighter future. The economic impacts are real from a national scale crisis like a pandemic. It is important to provide practical steps for how to address the impacts to all citizens, not just organizations. It is also important to be ready to come out of the crisis with a well-thought-out plan for economic recovery and restoration which can help inspire, empower, and equip citizens and businesses to thrive. The wisdom of using tough times for good means. What prepared the United States for WW the most? A case can be made easily for the public works programs that trained an entire generation to work together while giving them skills, which prepared them for both war and peace. Now think about that in our times. We should be prepared for and be preparing our fellow citizens and the national infrastructure for war and peace, while working towards avoiding war and forging a just peace. This is the proper approach for national modernization of our infrastructure, providing a foundation for a nation which all can be proud of and prosper in, each according to their talents and abilities and desire to take advantage of the opportunities available to them. We can turn our perceived weaknesses and failures into opportunities and an actual strength. We need to consider the following. It is important to have a national restoration and economic plan ready to go to inspire hope and unity with a vision for the nation that encourages and empowers the citizenry to channel their energies towards positive uplifting, transformative change they play a role in. This is what my American Next National Vision and Plan provides the framework for. It is an engine of inspiration for our nation. We also must create bridges between divergent groups to facilitate collaboration and mutually beneficial solutioneering. What we do in crisis should lay the groundwork for restoration and reconstruction of the nation. That can only occur if we all are willing to come together to do so, as each can according to their talents, capabilities, skills, hopes, and dreams. Are you ready to change your predicament? Are you ready to stop working against me and those like me? Are you willing to allow us to who God made us to be as well? May it be so. For we are stronger together than we are divided. Let us show what we can do together in all truth and love to light up the world and expel the darkness of our times by the grace and guidance of God. As for people, so do for the nation. Othniel Max Dave.